Harry. We also have for many years been discussing fair competition between publicly funded and commercial operators. It's been a debate that's going for 20 years or so in Western Europe. I understand it may shortly arrive here in Moscow with provisions to reform Russian public television, in which case we have a wealth of experience we would pass on to any Russian colleagues. At the moment, most of our work is based around copyright. There is a fashionable view in Brussels and elsewhere that copyright in programs needs to be completely overhauled to take account of the digital revolution and the internet. It's not a view I necessarily share, but it is one that is dominating the regulatory discussions in the European Union at the moment. We also have done a lot of work on the transition to digital broadcasting. Obviously, this is now complete for the vast majority of our member companies, but in a few territories like Serbia, Bulgaria, Ireland, there is still a lot of work to be done, even to do the very basic job of switching off the analog transmitters. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, the question of freedom of the media. We tend to forget about this sometimes in Western Europe, but there's a very fundamental right of a journalist to go about their job without interference, and there's a fundamental right of the media owner, the broadcaster or the newspaper, to distribute that content in the way they see fit. I know this is perhaps controversial in some parts of Europe, but I can assure you this is not a peculiarly Eastern European concept, and we have many cases at the moment in long-standing EU member countries where this is a serious problem. It's something we perhaps forgot about a few years ago, but it is now very much back on our agenda as well. And lastly, we've been asked by our member companies to do more as being the voice of the European industry, the European TV sector, and communicate key trends in the business. And this, of course, brings me on to connected TV. A couple of screenshots here. These are standard shots we use when we're talking about connected TV, as we do on a fairly regular basis. I don't need to explain it to this audience because you're all familiar with connected TV devices. If you haven't seen some of these menus, you will by the first coffee break, because there are examples outside. But just bear in mind some of these screenshots as we go through the rest of the presentation. It's striking at the moment that the discussion of connected television is dominating the European media industry. I think, put it this way, when I leave Moscow tomorrow morning, I'm going straight back to Brussels, where we have demonstrations with the European Commission, where we will be demonstrating how connected TV devices work for them. And then the week after that, there's another 250 people at a conference in Berlin about the future of connected TV, and then further discussions in Brussels, in Cyprus, in France. It seems to be almost every week you could, if you wanted to, be attending an event like this, where people, broadcasters, telecoms operators, equipment manufacturers, are coming together and discussing the future of connected TV. So why is this such a big topic at the moment? Why is it dominating everything else? Particularly at a time where there are many other interesting manifestations of change in the media sector, not least the arrival of OTT players like Netflix. To my mind, I think there are four main reasons why this has become so dominant in our discussions. First of these is the pace of change at the moment in the media sector. The second is the impact which connected TV services could have on the value chain. Thirdly, closely linked to number two, the question of who can commercialise the schedule, who can make money from connected TV. Fourthly, connected to number three, the questions of regulation. And in all of these, there's an open question about how we as broadcasters should respond to these challenges. I shouldn't hide from the fact that this presentation is written by somebody who works with broadcasters and is perhaps aimed more at the broadcasters in the room than anybody else. Firstly, the pace of change. You won't be able to read this slide, but it's not very interesting, so it doesn't matter. It's a one-pager that I put together last week because I was invited to speak at a hearing in the European Parliament about the changes going on in the audiovisual sector. And the MEP, the European MP who was organising the hearing, asked some questions in advance. And two of the questions he asked to me were, is there enough innovation in the broadcasting and media sector? And specifically, he was concerned that all the innovation, all the new business, was being driven by what he called non-traditional players and non-European players. So, in short, big US companies, telcos, ISPs were the innovators, and the broadcasters were the incumbent dinosaurs waiting to be taken over by more nimble companies. Rather than get into a discussion of, of just saying no, we're not, I put together this list of new online and mobile and connected services which have been launched by ACT member companies just in the past 6 weeks. And in a period of 6 weeks, we were able to track 19 new services launched across 15 different European markets. I won't read them all out, that would be extremely dull, but just some sort of examples for what companies are doing. We had apps released for live and on-demand content on the iPad in a number of markets. We had a sort of transfrontier service launched by CME in Central Europe. With an on-demand app on Samsung TVs in Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, Bulgaria, Romania and Croatia. And of course, coming back to our historic strength in programming and news, a number of our member companies were launching apps for news on tablet devices, smartphones, connected TVs, and increasingly also on Xbox and other games consoles. So there's a lot going on in our part of the world as commercial broadcasters. There's also a lot going on in some of our competitors, public broadcasters, cable operators, telcos. There's a phenomenal amount of new services being launched, and it's actually quite hard to try and keep up sometimes. So that's the sort of level of innovation that we have at the moment in the sector. Important to stress, though, to broadcasters that this is diversification. This is new revenue, and it's not replacing the core business. The core business of television is actually holding up rather well at the moment. Certainly, if you look at the three most important metrics that we have as broadcasters, are people watching our content, and are advertisers and consumers prepared to pay for it, the story is a relatively positive one. First of all, television viewing. The simplest but the most fundamental question that you have to ask as broadcasters, are people watching our programs? And the answer is that the average European last year watched linear television, so scheduled broadcast TV, for an average of 228 minutes per day. What's interesting about that figure is that it's actually increased every year for the last 11 years. So we've had a period of phenomenal explosion of choice in terms of how people use their leisure time, in terms of how people get their on-screen entertainment, yet what has been classical linear television, a schedule of programs, is actually more popular than ever before with European viewers. As a result, advertising is holding up in most European markets, not everywhere. It's fair to say that Greek television advertising is in the state you might expect it to be in, but in general, in Northern and Western Europe, TV advertising is stable or increasing, and subscription revenues, the willingness of people to pay for additional television, perhaps rather surprisingly, held up or even increased even during the worst period of the 2008-2009 recession. So that's the background. We're doing something right as broadcasters, which is that viewers love to watch our content, not just on classical linear television services, but increasingly on on-demand, tablet, and connected services as well. And it's in this context that I would urge the broadcasters in the room to view all the new connected TV platforms being demonstrated today and other times. Excuse me. Because if there's a proliferation, I mean, it is quite clear, and nobody is disputing, that many consumers will want to combine the best of the internet with the best of television. And connected TV is one way, perhaps the best way, of achieving that. But there are others. There's also the increasing apps market for broadcasters. There's also something as apparently simple as an OTT service like Netflix. And as broadcasters, the one thing we're good at is producing, scheduling, assembling and marketing the program content, and it's up to us to make sure that that content is available on whatever platform the consumer wants it to be on. As a gentleman speaking earlier said, ultimately it will be the consumer that decides the success or failure of these platforms. There was an interesting observation made at, I said earlier that there are conferences on connected TV almost every day. There was one on Monday in London, which I couldn't attend, but the BBC was speaking at it. By definition, the BBC isn't part of our network. They're a public broadcaster. And they made quite an interesting point about the relationship between connected devices and tablets. The BBC has launched, I think, probably the most successful and best known catch-up service, so catch-up television service in Europe, the iPlayer. And they reported at this conference that they were receiving 4 times as many requests for access to the iPlayer on tablet devices as there were on connected TVs, despite the fact that in the British market there are more connected TV devices out there than there are tablets. So clearly something is appealing to consumers about tablets, whether it's the form of use, whether online viewing is still something which is done individually as opposed to the collective social viewing of television, or whether it's the screen, whether the tablet screen is more easily understood, looks and feels more like a television than a computer, which for the mass audience we think is something that's quite important. So some interesting learnings from the BBC, which I think I would go along with. Second reason why I think connected TV has generated so much interest is the impact it has on the value chain. As broadcasters, we are fairly used to new market entrants. 20 years ago, there were 47 national television channels in Europe, so you could have listed them on one sheet of paper like that. Now there are between 8,000 and 10,000, depending on how you define Europe and how you define a channel. It doesn't really matter. But the point is, clearly, if the original 47 channels were the incumbents, if you like, they were very, very unsuccessful in protecting their industry, because there have been a phenomenal amount of new entrants, new product launches in the past 20 years. Many of these changes, be it the switch from analog to digital, the switch from standard to high definition, have been about creating a bit more television or a bit better television. Connected TV, by contrast, is, I think, something much, much more radical. And the final bullet point here, there are 3 things, I think, which connected TV can do, which could fundamentally change the landscape in a way that launching a few more television channels doesn't. Firstly, and it's probably why there are many people speaking here from the hardware manufacturing sector, firstly, connected TV potentially allows the manufacturers to get into the content business and therefore access some revenues. Historically, I guess it's fair to say that most manufacturers have interacted with the consumer only as and when the consumer is buying a new piece of kit, and thereafter they don't see that consumer for another 5 or 7 years until they choose to replace or upgrade. This could change with connected TV. Secondly, connected TV facilitates the entry into the market of what I describe as vertically integrated global players. I think we all know who I'm talking about, the big American ICT operators. Again, as broadcasters, that's fine. We've dealt with new entrants before. I think that's something we just have to deal with. And thirdly, it raises the very important question of who in this new landscape will control the last and arguably most important link in the value chain, i.e. who is it that will be selling the advertising to the consumer. And this is, I say on the slide, the single most important strategic question. It's also the most important commercial question or financial question. As broadcasters, with those 228 minutes of daily interaction with European consumers, we clearly have a very meaningful relationship with the average European consumer. Question then, who can earn revenue from that? At the moment, it's the broadcaster who earns the money because we, or our sales houses, sell the advertising space in and around the programme. In the connected TV environment, it's quite possible that a third party, platform operator, or a third party completely or a fourth party divorced entirely from the process, could also be selling in and around the programme. And that is something which is very, very different about the connected TV platforms from many of the other devices. Everything else we've seen, high-powered satellite, cable, hasn't called into question that fundamental change. Connected TV can do so. And that in turn impacts on the whole range of legal and regulatory questions that I've identified here. As you'd expect, for somebody based in Brussels, I spend a lot of my time dealing with rather overcomplicated legal questions. And there's an awful lot of micromanagement still in television regulation. A very simple question like, how many minutes of advertising can a broadcaster have per hour? You thought that's a fairly simple one to answer. You say 11 minutes, 12 minutes, whatever. In fact, there are separate European legal opinions on the definition of a minute, on the definition of advertising, and the definition of an hour. So it can get very, very complicated, and we get into this real micromanagement discussion. What's different about connected TV is that it takes us away from this level of micro detail and causes us to think about the very single biggest question of all in media regulation. Because there is a fundamental all of the rules that are imposed on broadcasters, all the rules about how many minutes of advertising, all the program quotas, all the obligations to have news at certain times of the day, all the ban on pornography or whatever it is. We only have all these rules because they can be enforced via a license. And for every one of those 9,000 European TV channels, there is somewhere a document between the broadcaster and the public authority. It can be an independent regulator, it can be the Culture Ministry, it doesn't matter for these purposes. And that document says the public authority will enforce on the broadcaster certain obligations, which you can only do because we as broadcasters are responsible for everything that appears on screen. So if we broadcast biased news, if we allow hate speech or racist or xenophobic material to appear on screens, if we show pornography when children could be watching, if we dare to show a minute too much advertising per hour, the broadcaster has legal responsibility. But that isn't necessarily the case in a world of connected TV, where third parties can also be putting content onto the broadcaster's screen. So how do we as broadcasters, how do platform operators react, how do regulators react, and more importantly, how do consumers, how does the society react? Because although broadcasters always complain about being over-regulated, and we are, some of these bits of regulation actually work in our favour. I mentioned earlier pornography and content unsuitable for minors. One consequence of that, of the heavy regulation on broadcasting in this area, is that plenty of parents are happy to leave their kids, young children, in front of a television set for half an hour without supervision. Very few parents would leave young children in front of the open internet without any supervision. So we can actually use some of these regulatory regimes also to our advantage as broadcasters. But certainly, the very fact that connected TV potentially at least undermines that fundamental stone of a license and a legal responsibility for everything on screen calls not just for an amendment of broadcasting law, but for a fundamental rethink of why we have these regulations in place in the first place, which ones can be thrown away and which ones remain valid also for the connected future. The final quote is not from me, it's a quote from the German regulators who are discussing this next week. If the TV screen is one among many portals, if the same images, apps and services can be used on different devices, that's also a challenge for media regulation. In terms of how to respond, as broadcasters, clearly we must remain open to all new platforms, all ways of distributing content. What's important, I won't go through this, I'll just show you a piece of paper. No, I won't. This is a charter signed by French broadcasters. I think there may be a translation around somewhere, I don't know. But anyway, it's signed by the public and commercial broadcasters in France, and it's basically setting out the conditions on which they will negotiate with connected TV platforms. Important for the French were protection of the broadcaster's signal, so the content must appear on the viewer's screen in the same state that it leaves the head ends or the multiplex or the playout centre. Anti-piracy provisions, we need a much more rational conversation about piracy in the next couple of years, and commercialisation of the schedule. In the end, though, neither the regulator nor the broadcaster will decide the success or failure of these platforms. As the gentleman said earlier, the ultimate decision will be taken by European consumers. Thank you for your time.
Окей, спасибо, Росс. Давайте поаплодируем докладчика. Коллеги, если есть вопросы, давайте воспользуемся.
Thank you very much, Ross. Colleagues, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask them. We have very many colleagues from other countries and regions here today, so if you have any questions, don't feel free to ask them. Albuquerque Company, I have the following question. Today, there is a certain consumption culture in the internet, and I have an impression that everything is moving towards this culture that used to be broadcasting culture. We see very good professional content, and on the other end there is amateur content with nothing in between. So what do you think about the future paradigm? Will it be closer to the internet culture or broadcasting culture?
I think it will be a completely new culture, which will be formed by a merger of the two. Unsurprisingly, I would argue that the broadcasting culture, I think, is going to sustain a lot longer than people think. I think fundamentally, people want to watch professional content. I think there is a limit to how much entertainment one can have from watching, user-generated material. And the challenge is going to be if the audience fragments, into thousands of tiny individual units. How then are we going to be able to finance that professional content? Because to make professional news, to broadcast professional sport, to commission original drama is a fairly expensive business. And that's the fundamental challenge, I think, for the sector. In the short to medium term, I think the television model will hold up and we will be able to do that. Later on, I'm less confident. We have to rethink the economics of production as well.
Спасибо большое. Коллеги, есть еще вопросы?
Thank you very much, colleagues. Do you have any more questions? So let's move forward. Now I'd like to introduce the next speaker, Mr. Petr Slopovsky, Vice President of Orange. You're welcome.